Picture this. You are dead, and your soul is hanging around the ancient Egyptian afterlife, and it wants a snack. I think if I had to choose an afterlife food, it would be Baskin-Robbins chocolate and peanut butter ice cream. But that was not really an option in ancient Egypt, so one of their go-to after-death delicacies was bread. So today we are making a bread depicted on the walls of a tomb nearly 4,000 years old. Ancient Egyptian flatbread, this time on Tasting History. So today's recipe is not really a recipe per se, because while the ancient Egyptians loved their hieroglyphs and did use them to write about food, they didn't use them to leave us any actual written recipes. Instead, they left loads of depictions of food being prepared on the walls of tombs. So we can use some of those depictions to recreate one of the many ancient Egyptian breads. Today's is a bread depicted on the wall of a tomb near Luxor, TT60, better known as Senet's tomb. Grind emmer or barley to make flour. Mix the flour with water to form a dough. Knead the dough in large jars or by treading on it. Take a ball of dough and shape it into a round, bake on coals or a griddle. So this is one of your simpler breads, something that would have been eaten by the majority of the population. But there were fancier breads available in ancient Egypt, ones that had milk and honey and eggs and coriander like the ones found in King Tut's tomb, and even lotus flower. And while today's recipe calls for a simple circular flatbread, the Egyptians also had well-risen semicircular loaves. And on a wall in the tomb of Ramses III, there is a bread depicted that looks like it was probably boiled before being baked, like a bagel. It also shows breads being molded into all sorts of shapes: round, spiral, triangular, conical, and even in the shape of a cow. There have been breads found in the shapes of all sorts of animals like crocodiles and even humans. And many breads were baked in molds similar to bread pans today. In short, ancient Egyptians loved their carbs, and other ancient peoples would often refer to them as bread eaters. In the Old Kingdom, there were at least 15 different types of bread, and by the New Kingdom, over 40. So frankly, I could make a whole host of ancient Egyptian bread videos, and maybe I will, but today I'm going to focus on one loaf. Actually, kind of two, because a lot of breads in ancient Egypt were risen, but not all of them. And this one really works either risen or not risen, unleavened. So for this recipe, what you'll need is about 2½ cups or 350 grams of emmer wheat. You could also use barley. Emmer and barley were really the staples of bread making during this time period. About 1 cup or 240 milliliters of water. Now, depending on what grain you go with and how dry it is and how ground up it is, the amount of water is really going to vary, especially when you add in leavener, which is going to throw everything off. So just be flexible. A ½ teaspoon of salt. They usually added salt to their bread, though it was not depicted in the image, but for flavor's sake, we're doing it. And 1 cup or 224 grams of optional starter. So while I'm using starter or sourdough as my leaven, which was used in ancient Egypt, they also used a lot of other different leavening agents, like sour wine, the yeast from grape skins, and possibly from the beer that they brewed en masse. So the first thing that you need to do is grind out your grain. Now, if you use either pre-ground grain or an electric mixer, it's going to grind it much finer than they would have had, but it's also going to be a lot easier, and frankly, it's going to be a lot easier to work with, so I won't fault you if that's what you end up doing. But I am using a hand grinder to better replicate the coarse grind that they would have had. What I'm not going to do is add rocks to my flour, because that probably would have been present in much of the flour of ancient Egypt. The way that they ground the grain, it often left a lot of grit in the flour. And archaeologists can tell from the teeth of mummies that besides cavities and gingivitis, that they also suffered from ground down teeth, likely due to the amount of grit in their bread. Also, even with this modern hand grinder that I used, it sure took a long time to grind that flour. In the Mastaba of Tai in Saqqara, it's written, "Grind, grind well. I grind with all my strength. The servant sifts the flour, and I bake the loaf myself." And while I didn't use all of my considerable strength, my arms were pretty tired after grinding all that wheat. So once you have your flour, add the salt, and the starter if you're going to use it, and the water. Then mix it all together and knead it. Now the wall depicts people either kneading it in jars or with their feet. I'm not going to do either of those things. I'm going to knead it in a normal, modern way, but you get the same effect. The thing is, emmer wheat doesn't have that much gluten, so no amount of kneading it is going to get you that nice, stretchy, elastic dough that we know and love today. It's also going to make it so that you're not going to get nearly the rise that you would get from like a modern sourdough. But it is what it is. But it is still really important to knead this dough because that's going to let the water incorporate into the flour, and this flour soaks up a lot of water, so you might need to add some as you go on. You'll have to kind of just feel it out. Then set the dough in a bowl and let it rise for a couple of hours. Now, like I said, this dough is not going to rise like a modern sourdough, but it will get puffy. I actually left mine for a total of 6 hours. I did 3 sets of 2 hours, and I would kind of punch it down in between each time, and it did get a bit of a rise. A bit. Now, while your dough is rising, I would really appreciate you hitting that like button and tap that notification bell so you don't miss any episodes of Tasting History. And now let us look at this Egyptian bread of the dead. Imhotep does not like rhymes. Fine, everyone's a critic. So just like you need food to keep you alive, in ancient Egypt you also needed food to keep you dead. Or at least keep you happy when you were dead. Because if you were lucky enough to make it to the field of Aru, or the field of reeds, it was essentially a mirror image of your life on Earth, so you were gonna need some food. Also, I really hope that you enjoyed your life on Earth because basically, you're just getting more of the same. On the east wall of the tomb of Sennacherib, an artisan in the 13th century BC, a vignette shows he and his wife happily harvesting grain and plowing their fields in the next world. A lot less harp playing and fewer fluffy clouds than our modern idea of heaven, and a lot more manual labor. Manual labor that required sustenance. And so Egyptian tombs are filled with sustenance. Loaves of bread, jars of honey and beer, baskets of grain, and for the carnivorous crowd we can turn to King Tut's tomb, which had 48 boxes of mummified meat, including leg of veal, antelope shoulder, ducks, and geese. And when it became impractical to keep filling a tomb full of actual food, then you just depicted the food on the walls. The walls of tombs are littered with images of stacks of snacks, instructions on fishing and hunting. My favorite thing about Egyptian hunting practices is that they often used cats, a skill that neither of the cats that I live with have had any desire to pick up. The wall images are also how we learn about how they cooked food, just like those of the bread making from which we adapted our recipe today. And whether it was physical food or just images of it, food was more than a luxury that you were bringing to your afterlife. It was part of your key to get into your afterlife. It was kind of like that $100 bill that you slip the bouncer outside of a fancy nightclub. Not that I have ever done that. I am nowhere cool enough to go to those places.
You still can't come in.
Nor would I ever spend $100 on doing that, but I've seen it in movies, so I know what happens. But instead of a nightclub, it's the Field of Reeds, and instead of a hoity-toity bouncer, it's Osiris. In the Papyrus of Ani of Thebes from around 1250 BC, one of the spells in the Book of the Dead details exactly what you need to get in. In this hall of justice, one shall utter this spell pure and clean, and clad in white garments and sandals, painted with black eye paint, and anointed with myrrh. There shall be offered to him meat and poultry, incense, bread, beer, and herbs. And really that's just polite, because this is Osiris's house and it's rude not to bring something when you visit someone's house. And this spell that you're supposed to recite after dropping off this goodie bag is one of the most famous parts of the Book of the Dead. It's called the Negative Confession, or Spell 125. Basically, everyone has gathered for the weighing of your heart. Osiris, of course, but also Thoth, Anubis, and the 42 judges, who depending on the time period might include Horus, Hathor, Isis, Ra, and a whole host of other gods. You have to remember that Egyptian history is really, really long, thousands of years. So any fact about Egypt might apply in one dynasty but not in another, and that includes things about their religion as well. So the gods change, it's just what it is. But it does usually happen that there are 42 gods there to judge your sins, and each god is offended by a different sin. And you need to admit those sins in order to move on. And there are some super serious sins, such as, Hail Am-Kaibit, who comest forth from Kernat, I have not slain men and women. Hail Her-Uru, who comest forth from Nehatu, I have terrorized none. But there are also some sins that are a little less serious, though frankly just as important to having a functioning society. I haven't been eavesdropping, I haven't been stirring strife, I haven't been prying into other people's business, and my favorite, I haven't been deaf to words of truth. I really, really like that one. Then there are a few sins that specifically have to do with stealing food. You can't have stolen bread from children, because who would do that? You can't have stolen cake from the spirits of the dead, and you can't have stolen grain in general. What's interesting is that while many of the sins overlap, everybody's list of sins was rather unique to themselves, because what might be a sin for one person might not be a sin for another just because of their place in society or the time period that it was taking place. Also, it being a negative confession meant that if you did commit a certain sin, then you didn't admit to it, you just left it out. So if you don't specifically say, "I did not debauch the wives of other men," we're all gonna assume that you did. But the most important thing when having your heart weighed was to not lie. Because if you lied, then you failed the test and you would be devoured by Amit, the devourer of souls. But if you were tempted to lie, then there's only one thing that can rat you out, and that is your own heart, sitting there on those scales. Lucky for you, there's a spell for that. Earlier in the Book of the Dead, you have spell number 30, which basically tells that little lump of cardiovascular tissue sitting on those scales to keep its bloody mouth shut. O my heart which I had from my mother, O my heart which I had upon earth, do not rise up against me as a witness in the presence of the Lord of things. Do not speak against me concerning what I have done. Do not bring up against me anything I have done in the presence of the great god Osiris. Now, provided that everything goes well, your spells worked, and you don't get devoured by Amit, the devourer of souls, then you finally get to see a glimpse of what your infinite future might be like. And for the priest Ani, that meant some really mighty fine victuals. Let there be given unto me vessels of milk and cakes and loaves of bread and cups of drink and flesh in the temple of Anpu. I will not eat the things which are abominations unto me. What I abominate is filth. I will not eat it. For my bread shall be made of the white barley, and my ale shall be made from the red grain of the god Hapi. Now, having served tables for a very long time, I am exceedingly polite to servers. But if I wasn't, I would totally steal that line. Is that mustard on my burger? I will not eat the things which are abominations unto me. Take it back! And refill my iced tea. I have spoken. Also that last line, my ale shall be made from the red grain of the god Hapi. Hapi was the Nile god and the god of grain, and while rather androgynous in many depictions, he's often shown to have quite a big belly and droopy boobs. Be nice, it's his quarantine body and he is working on it. Now, partly the depiction is because he represents fertility with the Nile, but it's also possibly, and I don't know this, because he ate too much of that grain he's the god of. Stick with me here. The ancient Egyptians actually had a big problem with being overweight and diabetes, especially in the pharaoh class, because it seems that a diet of mostly beer and bread, not really good for the physique, especially if you're not working it off. Luckily, if you were building pyramids, you did work it off, but you were paid in beer and bread. 10 loaves of bread and a gallon of beer each day. And based on some of the names of the groups of people who worked on the pyramids, it seems that they definitely enjoyed that beer, maybe all in one sitting. Graffiti in the area mentions one group of workmen known as the Drunkards of Menkora. And while I wouldn't consider myself a drunkard, a glass of beer, albeit modern beer, does sound like a mighty fine accompaniment for our ancient Egyptian bread. So once the bread is risen as much as it will, form it into several flat rounds. Do the same for the unleavened bread. Then get a griddle nice and hot and set the loaf on to cook for a couple of minutes before turning it over to crisp up on the other side. What's interesting is that to this day in Egypt, there is a bread known as aish baladi, which is basically the bread that we're eating today, albeit with a lighter flour that's going to let it puff up more like a pita. This one, you'll get a little rise, not so much because of the emmer wheat. And while I don't know this for a fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the rather stackable loaves that we're making today aren't the same type of loaves of bread that are mentioned in a document from the reign of Mentuhotep III. I advanced with an army of 3,000. The battle arena extended to the river and desert. I gave every man a skin of hide and a long stick to carry things, as well as 2 buckets of water and 20 loaves of bread for each day's ration. I mean, 20 loaves? They gotta be pretty stackable to carry them around, I would think. I don't know. Anyway, our bread's ready. And here we are, ancient Egyptian flatbread. So they're not that different. This is the unleavened and the leavened. The leavened definitely has a little puffiness to it, but it's still pretty thin. Let's give them a shot. Unleavened. You know what? Shouldn't have drank the beer, but there's some nice flavor there. It's chewy, but it's good. It actually has a lot more flavor than I expected. I guess that's, you know, it's a harder wheat to work with, but it's a more flavorful wheat to enjoy because there's nothing else contributing to the flavor except for a little bit of salt. But yeah, I would enjoy this with some hummus, dip it, maybe put a little, I don't know, cheese? I don't know. It's good. Now the leavened. I'm gonna rip it apart. Yeah, there's a little sponginess to the middle. You know, it's got like so many pieces still of the actual grain that I'm surprised it even held together. Let's give it a shot. That one has even more flavor. That's the big difference. The texture is actually even more chewy than the first one. Lighter and yet chewier, which is kind of odd. It's not as hard or crisp, but there is more flavor. That sourdough just, it livens things up even more. So let me know if you want to see more ancient Egyptian bread or ancient Egyptian foods in general. It's kind of like they had an entire cuisine for thousands of years. There's plenty of food to go through. And I also want to make ancient Egyptian beer, which is very different from this stuff. Anyway, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. Hardtack, salted pork, and acorn coffee. Now that's what I think of when I think of a meal a soldier might eat during the American Civil War. But what if I told you that bread pudding might also be on the menu? But there's a catch. You're gonna have to get shot first. Maybe a mild case of dysentery would work, because bread pudding is hospital food. So today, in partnership with the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, I'm going to take a look at the book that suggests bread pudding to be the perfect convalescent treat. And I'll show you how to make it at home, even if you don't have a musket ball lodged in your thigh. This time on Tasting History. Today's recipe comes from the Hospital Steward's Manual, written by Dr. Joseph J. Woodward in 1862. Boil 1 pint of milk with a piece of cinnamon and lemon peel. Pour it on 2 ounces of breadcrumbs, then add 2 eggs, half an ounce of currants, and a little sugar. Steam it in a buttered mold or pan for 1 hour. Well, that sounds easy. I mean, so many more specifics than those medieval or ancient recipes. So thank you, Dr. Woodward, for making this week a little easier on me. So for this recipe, you will need 1 pint or 475 milliliters of whole milk, 1 cinnamon stick, a bit of lemon peel, 2 ounces or 60 grams of whole wheat breadcrumbs, that's about a half cup plus 1 tablespoon, 2 eggs, a half ounce or 14 grams of currants, so about 1/8 of a cup of currants, and if you can't find currants, go ahead and use raisins, and 2 tablespoons of sugar. Now they used brown sugar and white sugar at the time, so, you know, it's up to you. I'm using white sugar, but either one is fine. And then you'll need something to steam it in. So you'll need a big stock pot with some water and a small pudding basin or mold, ceramic or metal, works fine. Now, if you're like me and you haven't had a lot of luck in the past tying handles onto pudding basins, then you can go online, I'll put a link in the description, and get one of these, which I got. They come with a lid and a handle, and they just take some of the pain out of making steamed puddings. Now you have 2 options when it comes to hot water. The best is to boil water separately, like in a kettle, and then you'll pour it into the pot once your pudding is in there, but you can also just boil water in the pot as well. Also, if you have a ramekin available, put it upside down in the bottom of the pot. Then you can set the pudding straight onto that instead of on the metal bottom of the pot, and it helps it to cook a little bit more evenly. Not a big deal if you don't have it, but if you do, give it a shot. So now for the pudding. Pour your milk into a small saucepan, add your cinnamon stick and the lemon peel, and then set it over medium heat until it starts to boil. Keep an eye on it because you don't want it to scorch, so once you see those bubbles coming up, take it off the heat and pour it over your breadcrumbs, leaving the cinnamon stick and the lemon out. They've done their job. Then add your eggs and whisk everything together until it's nice and smooth. Then toss in your currants and your sugar and whisk again. Then butter your mold or your pudding basin and pour the pudding inside. Now if you have a mold like I do with the top, now's the time to put it on. If you don't, then you're going to have to create a watertight seal using parchment, aluminum foil, and string. I am terrible at it, so I'm actually going to link to a BBC video where they show you step by step how to do it. It's fantastic, and I mean, making steamed puddings is what the British do, so just go straight to the source. It's going to be better, I promise. Then set the pudding into the pot and pour about 2 inches of boiling water around it. Then put the lid on and let it steam for 1 hour. Now the best thing is if you have a clear lid so you can see if the water has boiled away, because you don't want it to boil away. So you'll have to add a little bit more boiling water if that happens. If you don't have a see-through lid, like I don't, then maybe every 20 minutes or so just pick it up a little bit and see if it's starting to boil away and add some, but try not to let out too much steam because you need that in there. Now while our Civil War bread pudding steams, make sure to hit that like button and let us take a look at this hospital steward's manual that we've all been hearing so much about. Perhaps no subject is more worthy of attention in a hospital than the quality of the food and the character of the cooking. In the latter, there is certainly greater room for improvement in the United States Army hospitals than in the former. That was Union Doctor Joseph Woodward lamenting the fact that his hospital stewards didn't know anything about cooking, or medicine for that matter. And it might not be a surprise because here are the job qualifications the good doctor laid out. 18 to 35 years old, able-bodied, free of disease, honest and upright, of good intelligence, having a knowledge of English, able to spell and write correctly, and industrious, patient, and good-tempered. Note that there was no mention of medical or culinary background in that. See now, in the Civil War, hospital stewards had a lot of responsibilities. Besides the obvious keeping track of supplies, they also maintained surgical equipment, mixed and administered drugs like arsenic and mercury pills, something you'd probably want someone with a little experience to do. Sometimes they assisted in surgery, and of course, they managed the kitchens. This job had a really wide scope of responsibilities. But with those responsibilities came perks. They were the highest paid commissioned officers in the Union Army, they got their own rooms, lots of firewood, and best of all, they rarely were in places where they would get shot at. So of course the job was popular, and it didn't really seem to matter if you knew how to do it or not. See, it wasn't like it is today when only the most deserving and well-qualified candidates will get a job. Back then, you could have gotten the job just because your dad was rich or your uncle was General McClellan. Can you imagine such a crazy time? So saddled with a bunch of people who didn't know how to do their job, Dr. Woodward wrote the Hospital Steward's Manual, a down-and-dirty guide to whip those boys into shape. And one of the most important sections was the section on food, because Dr. Woodward was sick of eating boiled meat that was left, in his words, tasteless and insipid. Everyone's a critic. In the book, he talks about things that I would like to think that we take for granted in a hospital kitchen today. On no account should patients be allowed to come in person to the kitchen for their rations, nor should they be allowed to visit in the kitchen. Cleanliness is indispensable in the kitchen. The floors should be kept dry and well cleaned. There's a really cool section where he's talking about cooking out in the field, rather than like a brick and mortar hospital. And while he says that a good camp stove is the best way to cook, he also realizes that they're probably not always going to be available, and so he gives instructions on how to make a pit with a spit over it. What's interesting is that when he admits that cooking over an open fire can be difficult when the wind changes, he turns to Florence Nightingale for advice. During the Crimean War, Florence Nightingale noticed these Turkish soldiers creating these fire pits in such a way that when the wind changed, it didn't mess with the flame at all. Pretty cool. But what I think is so neat is that the English founder of nursing was having an effect on medical practices in American field hospitals. I love when historical characters kind of pop up like that, where they're not necessarily supposed to be. It's like finding an Easter egg in a Marvel movie or a crossover in your favorite show. I am such a dork. Woodward goes on to lay out the 3 meals of the day: breakfast, dinner, and supper. Now that's what my grandparents used to call it. Dinner for lunch and supper for dinner, which I never really got, but now maybe I see where they got it. They were reading the Hospital Steward's Manual. And each meal had 3 different menus depending on how sick the patient was. So you had the full diet, the half diet, and the low diet. And just to show you that nobody was living high on the hog, here's an example of the full diet. Breakfast: a pint of coffee with milk and sugar, a slice of bread and an ounce of butter, and some relish of cold meat, bacon, or meat stew with onion or potato. Dinner: a pint and a half of thin soup, or once or twice a week, a well-made stew of meat and vegetables such as onions and potatoes may be served instead of soup. Supper: a cup of tea and buttered bread on most days. Occasionally, mush and milk could be substituted for bread and butter. Hot dog, it's mush and milk day! Lucky me! Oddly enough, it was the patients on the low diet who sometimes qualified for something called extra diet, and that could be anything from eggs or chicken, fresh fruit, malt liquor, or bread pudding. But now the coolest thing about the whole book are the recipes, because so many of them are for huge quantities of food. Bean soup for 100 men, 8 quarts of beans, 20 pounds of pork, half a dozen onions, salt 1/2 pound, pepper 1 ounce, water 120 pints, 15 gallons. It does strike me that 1 ounce of pepper is not really enough for that quantity of food, but whatever. Then there's some really weird recipes, like beef tea with calf's foot jelly or isinglass. Beef tea. No. And my favorite is for a refreshing drink for invalids called toast and water. What could toast and water be? That sounds interesting. It's not. It's a piece of toast crammed into a jug with boiling water and left, and then strained out. Toast and water. Though Dr. Woodward does recommend not leaving it in the water for too long during the summer months because it could ferment and become alcoholic. And frankly, that sounds better than soggy toast. But for my money, the best recipes come from the extra diet section of the book. You've got something called Sawyer's Cheap Crimean Lemonade. It's probably cheap because it doesn't actually have any lemons. It has a little bit of lime juice, but not even all that much. But he does suggest putting some rum in it as an agreeable addition, and I would be inclined to agree. It's probably something Stonewall Jackson might have enjoyed if he couldn't get his hands on an actual lemon. See, I guess he was rather partial to the fruit. One of his officers after the war wrote, "A small piece was bitten out of it, and slowly and unsparingly he began to extract its flavor and its juice. From that moment until darkness ended the battle, that lemon scarcely left his lips except to be used as a baton to emphasize an order." I can picture that. It's kind of interesting. And he must have liked sour things because he also named his horse Little Sorrel. Anyway, I don't like sour things, so that's why I'm so glad that our bread pudding, sweetened with sugar, should be about ready. So after an hour, remove the lid of the pot and carefully take the pudding out of the water. You might want to let it cool just a bit before turning it out onto a plate. I did not let mine cool enough, and so the top kind of swanky. So here we are, Civil War bread pudding. The texture is looks really nice. Very custardy almost. Let's see. Let's take a taste. Okay. If this is hospital food, then we are going backwards because this is quite good, and I've had hospital food and it's not quite good. Really nice. I do wish a little more sugar in there, but even so, it's sweet. It's very eggy, very custardy. The texture is really smooth. More like a boiled pudding than a modern day bread pudding. The currants add that little bit of zing to it as well. It kind of cuts through the custardness of the egg. This is lovely. So moist, and in that second bite I got some of the cinnamon. It's really subtle. I wish it was a little bit more actually, but really subtle, but it's there. Really lovely. You know, if you had to go to the hospital, sucks, but at least you might get some bread pudding out of it if you're on that low diet. So thank you to Kyle Dalton and the National Museum of Civil War Medicine who really helped me with the research on this episode. I'm going to put a link to their website below where you can go browse if you're interested, or you can become a member or otherwise support the museum. So thank you again for joining me, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. Chicago-style deep dish pizza has to be one of the most polarizing and controversial foods out there. From Jon Stewart's famous rant,
"It's a casserole,"
to the feuds between fellow Chicagoans about which deep dish pizza place is the best. And since I am not one to ever sidestep a quagmire, I have decided to jump into this controversy by making the first recipe from the 1940s for what would eventually evolve into the modern deep dish pizza. So thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video as I look at the sordid and controversial history of deep dish pizza. This time on Tasting History. So I am back in my kitchen, finally, after like 6 weeks, and I'm loving it. It looks different. Different is scary, but frankly, it's more user-friendly, and since this is actually my kitchen and not just a set where I film, user-friendly is good. Unfortunately, that did mean that I had to get rid of my beautiful gas oven. It was leaking and not great, but that means I have a new oven that I have to christen, and I decided what better to christen a new oven with than pizza. And when deciding on a pizza, I decided to do Chicago deep dish, and since this is Tasting History, I'm not just making a deep dish pizza, I am looking back in time to find one of the earliest recipes for Chicago-style deep dish. And one has to ask, do you prefer Chicago-style deep dish, or do you prefer a New York-style or just more traditional-style crust pizza? I have to say I've always fallen into the traditional style pizza camp, but that's what I grew up eating at like Peter Piper Pizza and stuff. But I actually didn't even get to try a real Chicago style pizza until I went to Chicago last year. I went to several places that served deep dish and stuffed pizza, we'll get into that, but I didn't go to the place that it all originated, which was Pizzeria Uno, located at 29 East Ohio Street in Chicago. It opened in 1943, and in 1945, newspapers around the country published an article that had a recipe from the owner, Rick Ricardo, not to be confused with Ricky Ricardo. And I love that at the time, pizza was such a novelty food, at least here in the US, that the author, Gaynor Maddox, had to explain what it was. Pizza, pronounced pizza, is an Italian pie with a savory filling, usually made of sausage or anchovies and cheese. It's the after-the-movie snack favorite of teenagers. Also, I came across this old 1945 article while reading a modern article by Peter Regas, who is a Chicago-based food historian who is obsessed with pizza and knows like everything about it. I was really impressed with his research, and he just kept popping up while I was working on this video. Anyway, we'll talk more about him and his work in the history section of the video, but this is the recipe section of the video. And I'm actually going to be using 2 recipes to make this recipe because the first recipe from 1945 has details on how to make the crust and how to make the sauce. But in 1947, another article was published that detailed how to assemble a deep dish pizza. Both recipes were written by Rick Ricardo, so I feel like I can kind of mash the two together to make one recipe that's like the pizza that he would have been serving around 1947. And I'll put actually both full recipes on the website, tastinghistory.com, so you can see them, but for the purpose of the video, I'm mashing them together to make it easier to follow along. But I am making a main dish, and that main dish is deep dish pizza. Now, the original recipe calls for making 6 pizzas, and while I could probably eat 6 pizzas, I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to make one 12-inch pizza. So to make the dough, which is rather different than the modern style deep dish dough, what you'll need is 1 cup or 235 milliliters of whole milk, 1 teaspoon of salt, 2 tablespoons of sugar, 2 tablespoons of melted butter, 2.5 teaspoons of dried yeast, 2.5 cups or 300 grams of flour, and 2 tablespoons of lukewarm water. So first, scald the milk by heating it to around 180 degrees Fahrenheit or 82 Celsius, and then remove it from the heat and whisk in the sugar and the salt. Set it aside to cool to lukewarm as you add the yeast to the water. Now once the milk is cooled, you can add it to the yeast and then add in the melted butter and about half of the flour. Mix the dough until it starts to come together, then begin to add the rest of the flour in, but just a little at a time, working it in before adding any more. You may not actually even need all of the flour, you just want to add enough so that you end up with a smooth but not sticky dough. Knead it for a few minutes either in a machine or by hand, and then set it in a lightly oiled bowl, cover it, and let it rise for about an hour. Then uncover it, then punch it down, knead it into a ball, and set it back into the oiled bowl, and cover it, and put it in the refrigerator for 1 hour. Now, as I said, this recipe makes a very different dough than what you would typically have for a deep dish today, which has a lot more butter or sometimes even olive oil or other oils to make it more like a short crust, kind of a crumbliness, rather than bread-like, whereas this is pretty bread-like because it has a lot more gluten worked into the dough. And just as the dough is different, so too is the sauce. First of all, the recipe actually calls for canned tomatoes. And I'm thinking that maybe that was just for the purpose of the article and that he used fresh tomatoes in the restaurant, but I don't know, so I am going to be using canned tomatoes. Also, the amount of sauce in that original recipe, it is not adequate, and I did not realize that until I was actually assembling the pizza, and then I looked closely at both recipes. So the 1945 recipe is definitely for a thin crust and just a little bit of sauce like you would find in Italy at the time. Something though happened between 1945 and 1947 that totally changed the way he was making this pizza. First, he says that the dough should not be thin, and he says that you should be generous with the tomatoes. So more like a deep dish pizza. So I am doubling the amount of the sauce. So use 4 cups of crushed tomatoes, which you'll pass through a conical sieve, and then add 1 finely minced garlic clove, not nearly enough garlic in my opinion, but there it is, a 1/4 teaspoon of thyme, a 1/4 teaspoon of rosemary, and a 1/4 teaspoon of basil, and all of those should be dried rather than fresh. Then 1 dried bay leaf, 1 teaspoon of salt, and 1 whole onion. I thought that the onion would need to be chopped, but if you look later in the recipe, it says to take out the whole onion. So it's just a whole onion that he pops into the sauce. Mix everything together and then add in 4 cups of water. I also thought that this was kind of odd because you're just going to make a very watery sauce, but then you're going to simmer the sauce for 2 to 3 hours and you're going to let all of that water evaporate until you have a nice thick sauce once again. Now as the sauce cooks, you can take the dough out of the refrigerator, let it come to room temperature, and then spread it out into a circle, or whatever polygon I ended up making, and then set that into a cake pan that has been oiled with olive oil. And you want to have the dough come up the sides just as you would for a pie. Now I brought mine all the way up, which to be honest is probably too thick, because if you look at pictures from the 1940s and early 50s, the pies are not quite as thick. They're only about 1 inch, and I think I went closer to 1.5 inches, even 2 inches. C'est la vie. Once the dough is in though, you can cover it up and let it rise until the sauce is ready. And then it is time to assemble the pizza, and this is where things get kind of weird. See, in that 1945 recipe, it is getting assembled like a traditional pizza with the sauce and then the cheese and toppings on top of that. But something happened by 1947 where that switched and the cheese goes on bottom and the sauce goes on top, which is what is done in a deep dish pizza today. I just think it's cool that looking at these 2 recipes, separated by only 2 years, we can see this very major change in how deep dish pizza was assembled. Now, what is weird? That's not weird. What is really quite weird is that at the time, you could have a cheese pizza, or you could have an anchovy pizza, or you could have a sausage pizza. You wouldn't get the cheese and the toppings. So it was sauce and one of those 3 things, which I think is kind of odd. So if you want to do sausage, that's fine, but you should omit the cheese if you're sticking to this original recipe. I'm playing it safe and just going with a traditional cheese pizza. And to make a cheese pizza, the 1947 recipe says that once the dough is in, you should fill the plate with thin slices of mozzarella cheese, cover the cheese with tomato sauce, and be generous with the tomatoes. On top of the tomatoes, sprinkle plenty of grated Parmesan cheese, a couple of generous pinches of oregano, and some freshly ground pepper. then sprinkle with a few drops of olive oil all over. Then you pop that into an oven at 500 degrees Fahrenheit, 260 Celsius for 20 minutes or until it's done. This is a new oven for me, so I'm still trying to gauge the time. 20 minutes was a little too long, darkened up the crust too much, so it ended up being about 18, but just keep an eye on it. And while you do that, we can talk about the rather controversial history of Chicago's deep dish pizza. Now, there are numerous stories about the origins of the deep dish pizza, and frankly, most of them conflict with each other, so they can't all be true. I have been won over, personally, by the story told by Peter Regas. He is the food historian that I mentioned earlier, because his research is fantastic. Rather than just accepting the stories that are told, he actually went and looked at evidence from the period to disprove a lot of the falsities and half-truths in many of these stories. But to uncover the truth about the history of deep dish, we actually have to start with the official and probably incorrect story that comes from Pizzeria Uno themselves, the original home of the deep dish pizza. See, according to the company, it was founded in 1943 by Ike Sewell and Rick Ricardo. Ike, being from Texas, wanted to open up a Mexican food restaurant, but Rick had never tried Mexican food, so they made some, and Rick became violently ill and decided that he didn't like Mexican food, and so he fled to Italy for 3 months to come back with a recipe for pizza and an idea to open up a pizza restaurant. Well, Ike was fine with that, except being from Texas, he thought that that Italian pizza was too thin, too namby-pamby, and that he needed a heftier, everything is bigger in Texas style pizza, and so he wanted it deeper, hence the deep dish. Now you'll note that that version of events is from Ike Sewell, and he only started telling that story after Rick had died. And that, my dear viewer, is because it is utter codswallop. For me, the story falls apart right at the beginning when Rick tries Mexican food and doesn't like it, because how can you not like Mexican food? But more telling is what Peter Regas points out, and that is that in 1943, when Rick made his vacation to Italy to study pizza, he would have done so at the same time that the Allies were invading Italy during the height of World War II. Yeah, that just doesn't really pan out. Even more evidence comes in the form of leases and liquor license applications that show that Ike Sewell was not really part of it for the first year, pretty much, that the restaurant was going on. And so that's probably why years later, Rick's then wife was quoted as saying, "Ike Sewell didn't know beans about deep dish pizza. I think Sewell is a crook." Now, I don't know if he's a crook or not, that might be going a bit too far, but a teller of tall tales, most definitely. What's interesting is that it might not have even been Rick Ricardo's idea to make it into a pizza restaurant, because it kind of already was a pizza restaurant. See, Rick and his wife lived in the building of Pizzeria Uno, or that would become Pizzeria Uno, but when they were living there, the ground floor was actually a place called the Pelican, or the Pelican Tap, and they served pizza. But it was a really rough and tumble kind of place. It probably actually closed down to a murder that took place there, and so when that happened, Rick bought the place downstairs and decided that he would turn it into a pizza place, probably because it was already fitted out with pizza stuff. Mostly though, it wasn't that he wanted to make pizza, it was that he didn't want it to become the kind of place that it had been before. Ricardo, then living above the place, bought it for a pizzeria restaurant so that no damned noisy tavern with a jukebox could take it. Now, when it first opened in 1943, Pizzeria Uno was simply called The Pizzeria, and then it was Ricardo's Pizzeria, or Pizzeria Ricardo, and had several other names before it finally became Pizzeria Uno, which is still what it's called, and it's still in its original location on Ohio and Wabash in Chicago. Not long after they opened, business was booming, so they opened another spot just down the street called Pizzeria Due. And many of Chicago's other famous deep dish places, like Lou Malnati's and Gino's East, can also trace their origins back to this original Pizzeria Uno. But those origin stories also are maybe not so true. For instance, Lou Malnati's. Some often claim that Lou's father, Rudy, was the original manager of Pizzeria Uno and was the real genius behind the first deep dish pizza. But that ain't true, because the original manager was Rick Ricardo's cousin, and after he left there was another guy named Gino Volpi who was manager for a number of years. It wasn't until the 1950s that it seems Rudy even appears as manager. Now his son Lou Malnati, also worked there as a bartender, and in 1971 he decided to strike out on his own and open up his own pizza place. Lou Malnati's now has lots of locations, and I did eat at one when I was in Chicago last fall. Now the other spot that has ties to Pizzeria Uno is Gino's, and then Gino's East, which were opened by Sam Levine, Fred Bartoli, and George Blvd. But while two of those guys were actually from Italy, later they admit we didn't know pizza from nothing. So they had the rather bright idea of poaching the chef from the most popular pizza place in town at the time, and at the time that was Pizzeria Due, and the head chef there was a woman named Alice May Redmond. Now she had come to Chicago back in the 1940s from Mississippi, and she is the person who probably has the most effect on what would become Chicago deep dish pizza, because she totally changed the style of the crust. See, she was working with the crust that we are making today, which is more like a bread dough, and she said that she had trouble stretching it into the pan, and that's because a bread dough kind of shrinks back in. It is a little difficult to work with. So she doubled or even tripled the amount of butter. Basically, what she said that she did was she used a biscuit recipe that her family had been using to make the dough more like a biscuit so she could stretch it out more, and that's kind of what it is today. Now some say that she was successfully poached from Pizzeria Due, though her daughter said that actually she was working at both places at the same time. She was at Pizzeria Due during the day, and then at night she would go to Gino's. And it was only when somebody at Pizzeria Due found this out that they said, well, you gotta pick one. Well, she chose Gino's, and she was there for a while, then she went to Gino's East, and it seems that wherever she went, that was the best pizza place in town. First it was Pizzeria Uno, she was chef there, then it was Due, then it was Gino's, then it was Gino's East. So she should get a lot of the credit, I think, for making the best pizza, and yet she is the one person in this story who never had a restaurant of her own. Now it's also during this time period, like the 60s and 70s, that, so she's changed the crust, but also the pizzas start getting deeper. They go from about 1 inch to 1.5 inches to 2 inches, and they start playing with it. And some people start making what's known as a stuffed deep dish pizza, and that's basically an extra layer of dough, and all of the stuff is on the inside, and then there's stuff on top. It just makes it even more like a casserole. The place that made that stuffed deep dish pizza famous is a place called Giordano's, and I did go there as well, and that place actually I think has the best cheese pull, but it's just way too heavy. Then there is Pequod's, which I didn't get to go to, and they also do not have any connection to the original Pizzeria Uno, but they were making deep dish pizza, and they started putting cheese on the outside. It kind of made a crust of caramelized cheese. Next time I go, I really want to try that. Now each of these pizza places in Chicago seems to have their fans and their detractors, and I think that it's like a favorite pastime of Chicagoans to argue about which is best, especially when talking to tourists, because I feel like a lot of the Chicagoans don't actually even go to these places as much as the tourists do. But I was a tourist, so I went. Anyway, I'm not going to weigh in on what's best and what's not, except that I am going to weigh in on a pizza that isn't served anymore, because it is the original deep dish style pizza from the 1940s. And here we are, Rick Ricardo's original 1940s deep dish pizza. I mean, look at that melty cheese. It smells amazing, but let's give it a try. And this is definitely a fork and knife pizza. You don't pick this up with your hand. Here we go. That was really, really good. So the sauce is a little more watery than I would like, and I think that's just, I just needed to cook it a little bit longer to let more of the water evaporate, but the flavor is fantastic. It is, I would like maybe a little bit more garlic, but it is plenty flavorful enough. And that cheese, it's a nice, good amount of cheese. And the sauce isn't too much. Sometimes you get deep dish today and it's like 80% sauce, 20% cheese. I'd say this is 50-50, and that's the way I like it. One more bite. And the crust on the bottom it's cooked. It's not crisp, but it's nice and cooked through and bready. But I am going to just take a piece of this crust, which is really more like bread. It is not like a traditional deep dish that you'd have today. Get some sauce on there. Nice and chewy, super flavorful. I love it. I gotta say, it lies somewhere between modern deep dish and something more like a New York style pizza, and I kind of like that. Deep dish to me is just so heavy. 2 bites and I'm done for the day, I'm down for the count. But this, I could have several slices. Now, one more funny thing about that 1947 article. So the author talks about you get cheese, or you get anchovies, or you get sausage. But someday, when I'm very hungry, I'm going to try a pizza with the mozzarella cheese and the sausage and the anchovies. That should be something. This, of course, is how we eat pizza all the time today, with the cheese and the toppings. There's no reason to choose between the two, and frankly, he's right, it is something because pizza is awesome. And I will see you next time on Tasting History. Everyone loves bread, right? Well, how about blood bread? A favorite of Vikings everywhere. So if you ever get invited to a Viking Age feast and it's done potluck style and you have to bring something, make some blood bread. This time on Tasting History. So the Norse people of the Viking Age didn't leave us any recipes, but they did leave us archaeological evidence. And one such piece of evidence was some bread found at a Viking grave in Sweden. And an archaeologist named Sven Isaksson figured out what was probably in that bread. And it included blood, likely as a way to preserve it because blood doesn't have much shelf life. So this recipe is based off of those findings and can be found in An Early Meal by Daniel Serra and Hanna Thunberg. And I'll put a link in the description to where you can find that book. Now for this recipe, what you'll need is 1.5 cups or 340 grams of well-fed sourdough. I'm using a whole wheat sourdough, but you can also just use a normal plain flour sourdough as well. 3/4 cup or 180 milliliters of lukewarm water, 4 tablespoons or 80 grams of honey, 6 cups or 840 grams of whole wheat flour, and 2 cups or a half liter of blood. Any kind of blood will work. I am using pig blood for this. The cool thing is you don't have to add any salt to this recipe because the blood has plenty in it. Now this bread could be made in all sorts of ways, and it really depended probably on who you were, when and where you were. So if you were out Viking, the verb form of the word, and had just taken a pig from a monastery and slaughtered it, you might not have an oven to bake the bread, so it would be done on a griddle and possibly even be made unleavened. This would also be a really good way to dry out the bread, so you could make it into a sort of hardtack that you could take back aboard your ship. And you could make it with pretty much any kind of flour. They would have used barley or oat even, and they might have added some herbs or other flavorings that they had around. Since we're going to be talking about eating feasts at a fancy feasting hall, I'm going to be making it how it might have been made on such an occasion. So first, strain the blood through a sieve just so you make sure that there are no coagulated bits. If your blood has coagulated too much, then you can put it in a blender and blend it up for just a few seconds and it will reliquefy. Then add the sourdough and the honey and mix. Mix everything together as well as possible. Then in a large bowl, add it to the flour and mix. Then add the water, then work the dough until everything comes together. Now at this point, I would usually knead the dough by hand for 20 to 25 minutes, but I kind of ended up being so grossed out by the blood that I decided to use a stand mixer, and I don't regret it one bit. Either way you want to do it, go ahead and knead the bread until it comes together to form a smooth but still rather sticky dough. Then cover the bowl and let it rise for about 90 minutes to 2 hours or until it doubles in size. Now if you have kind of a sluggish leavener starter, then you might need to let it rise for a little bit longer, and you might actually want to do a second rise as well. Mine was very active, so I just did one rise for 90 minutes. When it's fully risen, punch it down and turn it out onto a well-floured surface. Then you can divide the dough pretty much however you want. You can do 2 large loaves, or I'm doing 8 smaller loaves. Whatever you choose, shape the dough into a loaf, then set it on a baking sheet and let it rise for another hour. Now, as I've often said, I am just wild about etymology, and since we are going to be talking about Viking Age feasts which would be given by a lord, I thought it only fitting that we made loaves of bread, because it turns out that was what a lord's job was early on, to make sure that everybody had bread. See, the word lord comes from the Old English word hlefwerd, or loafward, and they were meant to make sure that everybody was fed and taken care of. And lady, well, that came from the word hleftiga, or loaf kneader. So I guess she was originally making the bread. I thought it was kind of cool because in the Lord's Prayer, they say, "Give us this day our daily bread." It's kind of fitting. Anyway, before we got into the history portion of this episode, I wanted to pour myself a cup of mead because, Vikings and all, but I am completely out of the mead that I made now a year ago. Mead episode, link up here in the description. So instead, I found something called Viking blood mead. Now I was going to pour it into my ale horn, but then I realized that nobody would be able to see that, so I'm going to pour it into this glass instead. Let's give it a shot. There's definitely a reddish hue to it. I wouldn't call it blood red necessarily, but I can see where they got the name. Yeah, let's give it a shot. Oh, that's good. That is honey. And it's so thick, it's almost syrupy. It's like a spiciness to it. Honey and spice. That's what I'm getting. It's good. It's also 19% alcohol. So this is strong. You're not gonna want too much. I'm gonna be plastered by the end of this video, probably. Also, I got this from a site called Curiata, who has a wonderful assortment of liquors that you can't usually find in your typical liquor store, and I'm partnering with them for drinking history. They're providing me with a lot of the drinks. Anyway, so I will put a link in the description to where you can get this if you want it. This would be perfect for any good feast, a feast given by Danes, Swedes, the Norse, Saxons, really anyone who knew how to feast. But do you know how to feast? So, you've been invited to a Viking feast, eh? Well, what can you expect? What should you do to prepare? Well, the first thing you should do is same thing that you'd do if you were going to a party today, make yourself look presentable.
Hello, gorgeous.
Nobody likes a slob, not even a Viking, so when they weren't covered in the blood of their enemies after a raid, they were known to be quite fastidious, actually. In fact, one 13th century English chronicler, John of Wallingford, seemed annoyed at how clean they were. They were, according to their country's custom, in the habit of combing their hair every day, to bathe every Saturday, to change their clothes frequently, and to draw attention to themselves by means of many such frivolous whims. In this way they besieged the virtue of married women and seduced the daughters of even noble men to become their mistresses. He says this wooing of English women was one of the reasons for the St. Brice's Day massacre in 1002, when the English king Ethelred ordered the killing of Danes in the kingdom. Though since that took place about 200 years before John of Wallingford was even born, we have to take whatever he says kind of with a grain of salt, but it does seem that the Danes were known to be quite hygienic. And archaeological evidence backs that up because at Viking sites, along with swords and shields, archaeologists have found toothpicks, combs, nail cleaners, and ear cleaners. All the tools you might need to gussy yourself up before heading to the big feast. But before you spend too much time getting ready, you might want to take into account what kind of feast it is, because if it is a blot, or blood sacrifice, followed by a feast, you might not want to put too much work into it because you're going to get messy pretty early on in the evening. See, there were lots of reasons to hold a feast, and one of them was to get in good with the gods, and that meant some sacrifice. And usually at least 3 of these blots were held each year. One in the fall, asking for a good harvest, one at the beginning of winter to ask that everybody gets to stay alive throughout the winter, and then one in the spring thanking the gods for keeping everyone who survived alive throughout the winter and to bless the upcoming Viking or raiding season. Now there are several descriptions of these blots, one being from the Icelandic chronicler Snorri Sturluson. He describes all of the Lord's men arriving with ale to the blot and then watching as horses and cattle are sacrificed. But the blood would not have been used to make blood bread in these instances. Instead, it would have been used to sprinkle on the walls inside and out of the hall and the temple, and then it would be sprinkled all over the people as well. Now, I don't know if it was a carry situation, but I wouldn't spend too much time getting ready, and I definitely wouldn't wear white. Another description by Adam of Bremen around 1070 describes a specific blot that took place at the Temple of Uppsala in Sweden. Every 9th year there is a blot of 9 days, a common feast for everyone in Sweden. Then they sacrifice 9 males of each species, even men, and the bodies are hung from the branches of a grove near the temple. No one is exempt from this blot, and everyone sends gifts to the shrine, even the kings. Those who are Christian have to pay a fee not to take part in the blot. Now, something to keep in mind was that Adam was a Christian, and around this time it was kind of the last vestiges of infighting between the Christians and the old pagan religion in and around that part of Sweden where this was taking place. So he's not unbiased. But we do know that most of the stuff that he says is demonstrably true, but some things may not be, like the actual human sacrifice, which, at least by this point in history, was probably symbolic. Either way, still a pretty cool description. Now, once the opening ceremonies of these blots are done, everything else in the feast seems pretty standard. Snorri Sturluson describes the scene. The fire was in the middle of the floor of the hall, and over it hung the kettles, and the full goblets were handed across the fire. And he who made the feast and was a chief blessed the full goblets and all the meat of the sacrifice. And first Odin's goblet was emptied for victory and power to his king. Thereafter Njord and Freya's goblets for peace and a good season. Then it was the custom of many to empty the bragaful. And then the guests emptied a goblet to the memory of departed friends, called the mini. Or as Tupac would have said, pouring one out for the homies. Now all of that last part, the drinking, it was a very, very important part of the Germanic and Scandinavian culture at the time, and kind of still today, but definitely at the time. And most feasts began drinking from the bragaful, or the ceremonial mead or ale horn. Write we runes around the horn, redden all the spell with blood. Wise words choose I for the cup, wrought from branching horn of beast. Sadly, no runes on my horn. Now, Julius Caesar in his writings described these massive drinking horns that probably came from aurochs. But as aurochs began to die out in that part of Europe, they were probably replaced by smaller horns of regular old domesticated cattle. But they were no less important. In a description of an inheritance feast where a new heir would be made king or jarl, the bragaful takes center stage. The heir should sit upon the footstool in front of the high seat until the bragaful was brought in. Then he should stand up, take the bragaful, make solemn vows to be afterwards fulfilled, and thereupon empty the horn. Then he should ascend the high seat which his father had occupied. And Snorri Sturluson gives us an example of what that vow might be. King Ingjald stood up, grasped a large bull's horn, and made a solemn vow to enlarge his dominions by 1/2 toward all the 4 corners of the world, or die. Very serious stuff. Luckily, the rest of the feast gets a lot looser. So now you're here in the Great Hall, a massive rectangular building with a huge fire going down the center, meat roasting over it. You're probably sitting on a bench, maybe you have a table, maybe you don't. Where you're sitting in the hall kind of depends on how important you are. The king or jarl is going to be at one end up on a raised dais, and if you're important, you're going to be down there too, and if you're less important, or even worse, a child, then you'll be all the way at the other end. But don't worry, because everybody gets to drink.
Well, that's good news.
And the first round of drinks usually came from the lady of the house, and in Beowulf that would have been the queen, Wealhtheow. Then Wealhtheow went from warrior to warrior, pouring a portion from the jeweled cup for each, till the bracelet-wearing queen had carried the mead cup among them, and it was Beowulf's turn to be served. Now I'm guessing with one cup she didn't get to everyone, but that's okay because other cup-bearing ladies stood by with a decorated pitcher pouring bright helpings of mead, and the minstrel sang, filling Heorot with the head-clearing voice, gladdening the great rally of Danes and Geats. Yes, as people drank and food was carried around the room, the minstrels would sing and the skalds would recite poetry, and the Thaler would do whatever the Thaler did. See, nobody really knows, or at least can agree, on what this role did, but we know that it was important. Some scholars believe that it ended up devolving into the court jester, but earlier on in the Viking period, it was very important, and it kind of probably kept everything going, sort of like a maitre d' or an MC at a cabaret. They were also probably the one to kick off the round of toasts, which is where everybody got drunk. Ale was then served to them to drink. Many toasts went round, and a horn should be drunk to each toast. And at your feast, everyone gets their own horn. At least if they're a man, because often the women would have to share a horn with a man, and sometimes they didn't really even know that man all that well. At the beginning of the feast, lots would be drawn, and people would just kind of be randomly paired up together, kind of like those key parties that were popular in the 60s and 70s. And if you don't know what those were, ask your mom and be scarred for life. Now that everyone is sufficiently plastered, it is time to break out the games. Don't expect anyone to pull out a twister mat because the games would usually be either wrestling, boasting, or flitting. Now the wrestling is pretty self-explanatory, but the boasting, it was a ritualized boast called a beot in Old English. And essentially it was where someone would make a boast as to a future great deed that was usually put in front of them by someone else.
I triple dog dare you!
And the deed would often be just insane. For example, Beowulf uses the beot to vow to fight the monster Grendel without any armor or weapons. You can do these things when you're Beowulf, but you should not do these things. Now the other game, flitting, is a bit less dangerous, and it consisted of insulting other people, usually in verse. And while the tradition ended up becoming rather witty and clever in the later Middle Ages and early Renaissance, what we have from the Viking Age is less so. One is chronicled in the Poetic Edda. During a feast given by the sea god Aegir, the god Loki busts in uninvited and demands ale while insulting all of the other gods, usually by saying that they're either promiscuous or cowards. None of it's particularly clever or witty, it's just all kind of mean-spirited, and the other gods end up taking him and tying him to a rock using the entrails of his son, and then dripping snake venom on him, and whenever that would happen, he would tremble, and that's where earthquakes come from. So maybe it's actually not less dangerous if you're doing it with the gods, but usually it was less dangerous than the other things. Anyway, the feast will go on for many, many hours, even days in some instances, but as it does wrap up, you can hope for the best, but I would prepare for the worst, because while sometimes they would end with everybody passing out and going off to the, dark corners of the hall with whoever they were sharing their horn with, a lot of times it ended up in fighting. And honestly, that may have been a bit by design, because it was often used, especially in those inheritance feasts, to test how good of a leader the new king or jarl would be. And if you can control us all when we're completely plastered, then, you should be able to keep your wits about you on the battlefield. And many of these feasts took place either right after or right before a big battle. A Viking feast Earl Hakon kept, the land with Viking fury swept, harrying the land far from the shore, where foray ne'er was known before. So as long as you don't get beat up, or worse, have the monster Grendel show up and kill everyone at your feast, you should be good to go. Now, sadly, I have not been invited to a Viking feast of late, so I'm going to have to make do with my blood mead and my blood bread, which should be nice and risen and ready to bake. So once the bread is risen for about an hour, pop it into an oven set at 425 degrees Fahrenheit or 220 Celsius and bake for 25 to 30 minutes. Now because of the dark color of this dough, it's actually really hard to tell when it's done just by looking at it. So you'll probably want to tap on the bottom. If it sounds hollow, that means it's done, or you can use an instant read thermometer to check the bread. You're looking for a temperature of 190 Fahrenheit. Then let the bread cool completely and it's ready to eat. And here we are. Viking Age blood bread. So it's well risen. Definitely, I think I overproved it a little bit, but that's okay. I'm just gonna rip off a hunk here and give it a try. The crust it's well crusted. Let's give it a shot. Oh, I'm kidding. The flavor is lovely. I mean, it tastes like normal bread. I mean, it has this really dark color from the amount of blood that's in there. There is a lot of blood in this bread, but the flavor, there's no blood flavor, and there's no blood scent. You know how sometimes blood has that kind of very metallic, well, my kitchen smelled like it. Doesn't have that at all. In fact, with like a little bit of butter or some honey on this, it'd be hard to tell this from a normal, like, whole wheat bread. So the blood bread doesn't taste like blood, and the blood meat doesn't taste like blood, but both of them have blood in the name. Only one has blood as an ingredient, but either way, it actually makes for a pretty good meal.
If you've ever seen the movie Coco, you might remember a scene where families are in a cemetery and they're leaving food and drink on the graves of their loved ones. It's a tradition that has roots going all the way back to the Aztecs. And so today I'm going to make one of the most common offerings, pan de muerto. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video as I make pan de muerto using a recipe from 1938, this time on Tasting History. The Mexican holiday Dia de Muertos, or Day of the Dead, can actually last a few days, but usually it is observed on November 1st and 2nd and serves to honor deceased loved ones and some believe to reunite the souls of the dead with the living. There are numerous traditions associated with the holiday, but one of the most famous is the leaving of food and drink on the graves of loved ones or on the ofrenda, a sort of altar built to honor them. And I can think of no better offering than a sweetbread called pan de muerto. An estimated 30 million pieces of this bread are eaten in Mexico between October 30th and November 2nd and can vary in both recipe and shape. There are hundreds of ways to make this bread, but one of the most common versions that you'll see today is actually described in a recipe from 1938. It comes from Josefina Velázquez de León's cookbook Repostería Selecta, or Select Pastries. It is a very long recipe, so I'm not going to read the entire thing, but I will read a few passages as we go through the baking. But first, the ingredients. What you'll need is 4 cups or 500 grams of bread flour, 1.5 tablespoons or 14 grams of dried yeast, 2 eggs plus 5 yolks, 2/3 cup or 130 grams of sugar, 8 tablespoons or 113 grams of butter, and 8 tablespoons or 113 grams of lard. She's big on lard in all of her recipes, but you can just use all butter. It's not going to make a huge difference. 2 tablespoons of orange blossom water, 2 teaspoons of orange zest, 1 teaspoon of anise, 1 teaspoon of salt, and 1 more egg to attach the decorations. So first, make a starter by mixing the dried yeast with a half cup or 120 milliliters of lukewarm water and about a half cup or 60 grams of the bread flour. Mix it all together, then cover it and set it aside for about 25 to 30 minutes. And while it sits, she says to cook a teaspoon of anise grains and 6 tablespoons of water. Simmer for 2 minutes. Remove the mixture, strain it, and let it cool. So add the anise to 60 milliliters of water and set over a medium heat and bring it to a simmer for about 2 minutes. Then pour it through a sieve and let the water cool. Then add the salt and sugar to the remaining flour and whisk them in along with the orange zest. Once the starter dough has become nice and puffy, add it to the flour mixture along with the 2 eggs and the 5 yolks and the orange blossom water and the cooled anise water. Mix this either by hand or using the paddle of a stand mixer on low until all of the ingredients have come together to form a dough. Then switch to a dough hook and knead the bread for 10 to 12 minutes or until it has come together and pulls away from the sides of the bowl. Then we're going to start adding in the butter and the lard, and we're going to do it slowly, and it is going to become very, very sticky. This may be the stickiest dough I've ever worked with, so yes, you can do it by hand, but no, you should not do it by hand. If you have a stand mixer, now's the time to use it. So on a low speed, add a few tablespoons of butter or lard, and then let it knead in, and once it's incorporated, add a few more tablespoons, and repeat until all of the butter and lard are well incorporated into the dough. Then go back to kneading the bread on medium-high for another 10 minutes. After about 10 minutes, it should become a nice smooth dough, but it is still going to be really, really sticky, and you're going to be tempted to put some more flour into this. Don't, just let it be a sticky dough. Once it's come together, put it in a lightly greased container and allow it to rise for about 2 hours or until it's doubled in size. Then turn the dough out onto a lightly greased surface, fold it over on itself, and then return it to the container, cover it, and let it sit overnight. Now she says to let it sit for 6 to 12 hours at room temperature, but she must have a very, very cold house because it will just go crazy if it's left at like 75 or 80 degrees. So I would put it in the refrigerator overnight and then let it raise back up to room temperature the next morning. Either way, once it's had plenty of time to rise, punch it down and turn it out onto a lightly greased surface, and you can divide it into as many pieces as you want. She's not specific. I'm doing 4 rather good-sized loaves, but you can do like 2 really big ones or 8 or 16 smaller ones. But she also says to decorate with bones and tears which are made from the same dough and stick with egg. Like I said, there are many, many ways to shape this bread, this pan de muerto, but this is one of the most common, with little strips of dough that are supposed to symbolize bones, and then one in the center, which many people have different ideas of what that symbolizes. She says it's a tear, so we're going with a tear. So take about 300 grams of dough and set it aside for the decoration, and then divide the rest into 4 pieces, or however many loaves you want to make. Shape each piece into a ball, and then press them down gently on a lined baking sheet to make them flatter on top. Then take the remaining dough and make 4 small balls, or tiers, which will go on top of the bread, and roll out the remaining dough into 4 long ropes, about twice the size of each of the large loaves, and divide those into 4, rolling the center of each to be a little thinner than the ends to give them the appearance of bones. And it's more just the suggestion of bones. Honestly, it's going to lose a lot of its shape in the baking anyway, so if it doesn't exactly resemble a femur, that's okay. Then take that final egg and whisk it with a little water and brush just a bit onto each of the bones and set them in a cross on the top of the loaves. Then do the same with the tear, setting it in the center of the loaf and pushing it down firmly to make sure it stays put. Then cover the loaves and let them rise for about another 90 minutes or until they have doubled in size. I started with all 4 on one tray. They do double in size, so I ended up having to split it up into 2 trays, give them plenty of room to grow. Once they've doubled in size, brush them lightly with the remaining egg and water mixture, then set the loaves in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 175 Celsius and bake for another 20 to 25 minutes. It's obviously going to depend on how big your loaves are. Mine took about 23 minutes. And while they bake, make sure you are subscribed to Tasting History so you never miss an episode where you'll learn things like the origins of Dia de los Muertos. As with most holidays, the origins and traditions surrounding Dia de los Muertos are a medley of different traditions and celebrations that preceded it, some from Europe and some from pre-Columbian Mexico. Its pre-Columbian roots grew from the traditions of the Aztec, Toltec, and other Nahua civilizations. Now, to begin to understand some of their traditions surrounding the death of a loved one, it's important that we know a bit about how they regarded death. And to sum up the feelings of an entire civilization on a certain topic is not easy to do, maybe impossible to do, especially when most of their writings were destroyed. But there is a poem from Nezahualcóyotl, the 15th century pre-Columbian ruler of Texcoco, that shows that the inevitability of death was not something to be feared, but rather to be accepted as another part of life. Even jade will shatter, even gold will crush, even quetzal plumes will tear. One does not live forever on this earth, only for an instant do we endure. Now, just because death was not something to be feared doesn't mean that it wasn't something to be mourned, especially when it was the death of a loved one. And the Aztecs specifically had a very specific way of mourning their dead. After someone died, they would mourn them for 4 days each year, and only for 4 days for 4 years. They would weep, of course, but it was also more of a celebration of the person's life, with singing and dancing and eating their favorite foods. It actually sounds like a very healthy way to treat the subject. During those 4 years, the loved one would make their way to the final afterlife. And once those 4 years of mourning were over, there was no more mourning for that person ever. Remembering them, yes, but mourning them, no more. And for the most part, everyone did their mourning at the same time. It was done during 2 festivals, Micailhuitl, or Feast of the Little Dead, and Hueymicailhuitl, or Great Feast of the Dead. The first was held in early August and was meant to mourn the deaths of children, and the second was held 20 days later and meant to mourn the deaths of adults. And the mourning happened in conjunction with the celebrations of their lives. What's really cool is that we have descriptions of these events, both from Catholics who were watching from an outsider's perspective, but also several from Aztecs who were writing things down following the Spanish invasion of Mexico. For example, Aztecs who were writing for Friar Bernardino de Sahagún wrote, 2 days before the feast there was the seeking of flowers, and when they had been gathered, when it was dawn, then they were strung together, then they were twisted, they were wound in garlands. And when this was done, all the common folk together fell to making tamales for themselves. Tamales and flower garlands still being popular today during Dia de los Muertos. The flowers today are typically marigolds, which in Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, were called Sempoaxochitl, which became the Spanish Cempasúchil. And they were the choicest flower offered to the god Huitzilopochtli. And after the offering, there was a massive feast with singing and dancing, and only the revered old men and the revered old women drank pulque. And he who became really drunk cried out at people or boasted of his manly deeds. Now today it's typically mezcal or tequila that makes one boastful of their manly deeds, and it's not just the old people. It applies to everyone, I think. Now that is a wonderful description of the celebration, but there are also descriptions of the more somber moments during the festival. Each year when they celebrated the Feast of the Dead, while the priests made sacrifices, everyone, each in his own house, climbed onto the terrace roofs of their houses and looking toward the north at night, recited great prayers to the dead, each one to his ancestors. and speaking aloud they said, "Come quickly, for we are awaiting you." This codex, which was written by a Spaniard, also describes aspects of the second festival which seem very familiar to the modern Dia de los Muertos. During this month, they once again celebrated the Feast of the Dead, and it was bigger than the preceding one. The last 3 days of this month, all the living feasted in honor of the dead, and they went out to play in the country as a way of celebrating. During this feast, they made offerings to the dead, placing food and drinks on their tombs, which they did for 4 years, for they believed that during all this time, the souls had not yet gone to their place of rest, according to their belief. Now, in the study of religion, there is an idea called syncretism, and that is when a religion, a new religion, takes parts of an old religion and kind of brings them in to help bring people into the fold. Sometimes this is done very much on purpose, and sometimes it's just happenstance because it's human nature to keep doing the traditions that you've always been doing. But in this case of taking the food and putting it on the graves of the loved ones, at least according to the Franciscan friar Diego Duran, it was not something done by the Christians as a way to ease the transition into Christianity, but rather it was done by the Aztecs as a way to embed their practices into their new holidays of All Hallows and Day of the Faithfully Departed, November 1st and 2nd. And Friar Duran did not like that. I wish to refer to something I have seen take place on the Day of All Hallows and on the Day of the Faithful Departed. In some towns, offerings are made. When I asked why offerings were made on the Day of All Hallows, I was told that this was in honor of the children, it being an ancient custom which had survived. I inquired whether offerings were also made on the Day of the Faithful Departed, and the answer was yes, in honor of adults. I was sorry to hear these things because I saw clearly that the Feast of the Little Dead and the Feast of the Adults were still being celebrated. On the first I saw people offering chocolate, candles, fowl, fruit, great quantities of seed and food. On the next day I saw the same being done. Though this feast fell in August, I suspect that if it is an evil simulation, which I do not dare affirm, the pagan festival has been passed to the Feast of All Hallows in order to cover up the ancient ceremony. But the fact that Duran was so upset at their bringing offerings to the dead seems to be only because he made the connection between that practice and the now illegal festivals of the Aztecs, because it wasn't just the Aztecs who did it, the Spaniards did it as well. Often on All Souls' Day back in Spain, it was common to leave food, candles, and flowers on the graves of deceased loved ones, and surely that practice came across when the Spanish came to the New World. Another thing that they brought with them was the bread itself. Now, the Aztecs had bread, but it was very different from the bread that is pan de muerto today. Typically, their bread was an unleavened loaf made with corn or amaranth and was sweetened with honey. But it was the Spanish who brought the yeasted wheat loaf that was sweetened with sugar that we know as pan de muerto today. Now, both people would often form these breads into different shapes, like the Aztec papalo tlaxcali, which was a bread formed into the shape of a butterfly. But when it comes to the more common bone-shaped decorations that we see in the bread today, that likely came from the Spanish, possibly stemming from another food eaten on All Souls' Day called huesos de santos, or bones of the saints. These were and still are marzipan treats that are shaped into little bones, and they've been around for a very long time. One of the first mentions was in a 1611 cookbook by Francisco Martínez Motiño. Today the shape is a little less literal. It doesn't look exactly like a bone, but still it's usually an elongated cylinder that is white and often filled with something resembling marrow, though usually it's some sort of sweet custard made with egg yolk. And still today these are often left on the graves of deceased loved ones on All Souls' Day. Now, it's impossible to say if these really were the inspiration for the bone-shaped design on Pan de Muerto today, but it's clear that the Spanish who were coming over to America had no problem shaping food like body parts and leaving it on the graves of their loved ones, so very well could be. Like with most foods, it's impossible to pinpoint an exact origin of any aspect of it. Rather, it's an amalgam of many traditions and many foods that have come before it. It's why, when it comes to Pan de Muerto, there is no one recipe or one shape to follow. There are so many, unless you're watching this show, which you are, in which case there is one recipe and it wraps up just like this. Once the bread is fully baked and the bottoms are golden brown, remove them from the oven and let them cool. And as they do, the recipe says to make a sugar glaze. Today that glaze is usually made with egg and sugar, very, very simple. Hers, a little less simple, but not too hard. What you need for that is 1 tablespoon of flour and a half cup or 120 milliliters of water. Then she says to dissolve flour in water, cook and keep moving continuously until it reaches a consistency of thick cream. So whisk the flour into the water and set it over a low heat and stir it until it thickens, about 5 or 6 minutes. And once it hits that consistency, take it off the heat, but keep stirring until it's fairly cooled, and then brush it onto each of the loaves and quickly dust them with a generous amount of sugar. Let them sit for about 5 minutes and then dust them once again with plenty of sugar, and they are ready for the ofrenda. And here we are, pan de muerto to offer up on Dia de los Muertos. It is a thing of beauty, I gotta say. It smells so good. Yeah, so sometimes when they rise, all the things go kind of wibbly. Pieces fall off and whatnot. So you can kind of readjust while it's still hot, and they should do just fine. Look at that. Nice and fluffy, well baked, if I do say so myself. I'm gonna take this piece right here. That's fantastic. You really get the orange. That's what really hits you. The anise is very mild, which is good because I don't love anise. And it's nice because it does combat the sugar. I mean, there's a lot of sugar on top. But it's the orange that really comes through. And it's so soft and pillowy. Kind of reminds me of the texture of a Sally Lunn bun, which I did when I first started the channel and is still one of my favorite breads that I've ever made. Yeah, you should make these. If you like bread, and who doesn't like bread, I promise you, these are definitely worth making. A little bit of work. They got to sit overnight, but the flavor is fantastic. We all know the phrase American as apple pie, but really it should be as English as apple pie. Because today I am making the first recorded recipe for an apple pie, which actually comes from 14th century England. So thank you to Factor for sponsoring this video as we make a medieval apple pie, this time on Tasting History. Today's recipe comes from my favorite historic cookbook, The Form of Curry, meaning the proper method of cookery. And it comes from around the year 1390 and was compiled in England by the chief master cooks of King Richard II. So because the recipes were written for the king, you can be sure that a lot of the ingredients are pretty nice and wouldn't be things available to most people at the time. Also, because it was written in the royal kitchens, you can be sure that the instructions are somewhat vague, especially for to make tarts in apples. Take good apples and good spices and figs and raisins and pears, and when they are well y-brayed, colored with saffron well, and do it in a coffin, and it forth to bake well. So this recipe leaves a lot up to interpretation. First of all, it doesn't give you any quantities for the ingredients of any kind, it doesn't specify any of the spices except for saffron, and it just assumes that you know how to make a coffin being a type of crust that you would either cook food in or simply store food in. So why is it so vague? Well, the royal kitchens would have had dozens, if not hundreds of cooks working at any given time, and only the master cook knew all of the components of an entire meal. And they would often sit at the center of the kitchen, not doing any cooking of their own, but rather calling out orders to those who were doing the cooking. And on occasion, there would be a scribe nearby scribbling down some of what he said, and that is what the form of curry is. So it's kind of like writing down a recipe via a game of telephone where the person who's actually writing down the recipe isn't probably a cook at all and doesn't really know what they're doing. So it just leaves a lot up to interpretation, but the nice thing is, anyone who actually made these dishes originally is dead, and so there's nobody around that can tell you that you've really done it the wrong way. So, for my interpretation of this tart of apples, what you'll need is 3 pounds or 1.3 kilograms of apples, a mix of sweet and tart, 1 pound or a half kilogram of pears, half a cup or 80 grams of raisins, and half a cup or 60 grams of chopped dried figs.
Now those last two ingredients would have been pretty pricey at the time because they would have been imported either from France or around the Mediterranean. But the spices are actually what would have made this dish have a price through the roof. Now last, the only spice the recipe calls out by name is saffron, and that is the one spice that grew in England at the time. And for this recipe, 8 to 10 threads mixed with a little water will do. Frankly, it doesn't have a great effect on the color, and the taste is minimal, so you could probably leave it out if you wanted to. As for the other spices, you can't leave those out, but we don't really know what the spices were. But I would assume it is some sort of poudre douce, or sweet powders, which was a common spice mixture in the Middle Ages for things like this. Now this spice mixture would change from kitchen to kitchen and cook to cook, but my version of poudre douce is going to be 2 tablespoons of sugar, 1.5 teaspoons of cinnamon, 1 teaspoon of ginger, a half teaspoon of nutmeg, a half teaspoon of cardamom, and 1/8 teaspoon of cloves. And yes, sugar was considered a spice. In fact, we just don't call it a spice because we use it in such large amounts. And if we called it a spice, then you would have to consider a Snickers bar a spicy food, which I guess technically it is. So start by chopping your apples and your pears. Of course you should remove the core, but you don't really need to remove the skin because it's going to be cooked so much that it's not going to matter. Also, the skins will be barely recognizable once we mash these up. The recipe uses the word Blvd, which essentially means ground, so you can mash them in a mortar or in a bowl with the end of a rolling pin like I did, or just put them in a food processor. It all ends up as a mush of fruit. To this mush, you add the raisins and the chopped figs, as well as the saffron water. Mix that in, and then add in the mixture of sugar and the other spices. Again, you can remove any of these spices or add others like galangal or even black pepper if you want. What spices to use would have been up to the cook then, and it is up to you today. Let us get back to that pie. So with the filling ready, it is time to make the crust. And there are lots of ways to make a medieval crust. Some were meant to be eaten. They would have eggs and even sugar or saffron in it. And then some were just meant to be a container and rarely were ever eaten at all. Today, I'm going to use a crust that is kind of in the middle. It's a hot water crust pastry. It is very edible, but it's also really sturdy, so we can get a nice standalone pie. So for this, what you'll need is 4 cups or 500 grams of flour, 1 teaspoon of salt, 1 cup or 235 milliliters of water, and 1 cup or 225 grams of suet or lard. So first, bring the water to a gentle boil on the stove and then add in the fat and let it melt. You can also add in the salt right now, but if you forget, like I did, then you can add it later. It's not a big deal. Once the fat has melted and it is simmering, pour it into the flour and start to mix it all together. Here is where I remembered to add the salt. Eventually, it will all come together and be cool enough to handle with your hands. And you want to knead it for just a minute or so until it becomes nice and smooth, and then let it cool for just a couple minutes until it's still warm but cool enough that you can handle it. You don't want to let it cool too much because it does start to get hard to work with if you do. And you still want it warm when you divide it. You want one large piece, about 3/4 of the dough, and then a smaller piece, about 1/4 of the dough. Take the larger piece and press it into a mold. You can use a cake pan or a springform pan. The great thing though about hot water crust is that it is very forgiving. Unlike a normal pie crust, which is like a hot house flour, you can't do anything to it or else you'll screw it up. This is more like Play-Doh, and you can just mash it in, mold it however you want. Heck, if you have a crack, just take a little bit more and patch it up. Just don't let it get too cold because it does become more and more prone to cracking as it cools. Then once you have the main part of the coffin made, you can add your apple filling and pack it down. Then roll out the second smaller piece of dough and set it on top of the filling, tuck it in, and crimp the edges to seal the filling in. Then cut out a little hole on top or pierce it a few times to let the steam out. Then you can either bake it as is, or you can brush the top with a bit of egg to give it some nice color. In the Middle Ages, they would often even add saffron to make it more golden. Then set it in the oven to bake at 375 degrees Fahrenheit, 190 Celsius for 45 to 50 minutes or until it is bubbling on top. Now, while we're able to recreate many aspects of this medieval pie, there are some things we simply will never be able to, namely the fruit that is inside. Around the year 800, the Emperor Charlemagne named a host of apple varieties that he wished to be grown on his lands. The names of apples are Gosmaringa, Geroldinga, Crevedella, Spirauca. There are sweet ones, bitter ones, those that keep well, those that are to be eaten straight away, and early ones. Alas, while we know the names of these and other medieval apple varieties, most of them are either extinct or they've changed so much that there's no reason to think that they are the same now as when this pie would have originally been made. But it's clear by Charlemagne's list of apples that that fruit was very popular in medieval Europe. So, while our pie bakes and you make sure you're subscribed to Tasting History, let's take a closer look at the medieval apple. During the Roman Empire, apples were one of the many fruits which were cultivated all across Europe and Britain. But as the empire crumbled, so too did the apple orchards. See, apples are unlike most fruits. If you take an apple seed and plant it, the resulting tree will likely not be the same as the apple that the seed came from. The size, the taste, the smell, the color, everything can be different from the original apple. So to get a copy of that original apple, it needs to be grafted onto an existing rootstock. This is something that takes patience and skill, and at least by some accounts, this patience and skill were not something that those people replacing the Roman legions had. In 6th century Britain, for example, a monk named Gildas Sapiens, or the Wise, wrote a work which translates to the conquest and ruin of Britain. And in it, he goes on a bit of a tirade about the fall of Britain and how things are changing around him, and everything is collapsing, including the fruit orchards, and he blames it on immigrants, the impious Saxons, a race hateful both to God and men. Nothing was ever so pernicious to our country, nothing ever so unlucky. He says these newcomers don't care at all about husbandry, so the crops of Britain have all gone to pot, including the apple trees. Now, Gildas was a bit of a curmudgeon and probably overstated the loss of all the apples in Britain at the time, because in subsequent centuries there is evidence for non-wild apples being in existence where he lived. But many of these apples were probably not cultivated by the new Saxon farmers, but by monks like himself. Much of the agricultural knowledge known to the Romans survived due to the monasteries of Europe, as they were often committed to growing most, if not all, of their own food, so they never had to leave the walls of their monasteries. And when they would establish new monasteries, they would often take that knowledge along with the actual tree grafts with them to spread different types of fruit around Europe. This led to a renewed expansion of different varieties of apples, and many of these apples stayed within the confines of monasteries for a long time, until around at least 800, when the new emperor Charlemagne set out the Capitulare de Villis, or Rule of Land Use, which decreed that the royal lands around cities should be used to grow food, and not just grains, but fruits. As for trees, it is our wish that they shall have various kinds of apple, pear, plum, sorb, medlar, chestnut, and peach. Now, surely the rise of these fruits and medieval horticulture in general cannot all be traced to this one act, but it was definitely influential, especially in France. And so, when the French, specifically the Normans, ended up invading England in 1066, they are thought to have brought a number of apple varieties with them. There were the Pearmain, Pippin, Faro, and Renette. Some of these names actually still exist today, though it's unlikely that they are actually the same as their medieval ancestors. One of the most popular varieties at this time was something called the Pomme Costard. It was mentioned on a fruiterer's bill for King Edward I in 1292, and in 1296, 1 shilling could get you 100 costard apples in the city of Oxford. And while that may sound like a smacking good deal, you have to remember that the average laborer made just over 1 shilling each week at that time, so those are some pretty expensive apples. Now, one reason that these apples, the costard, was so popular was that it was not only good for eating, but also for drinking, turning into cider, which I will get back to. As for eating, many medieval and Renaissance authors agree that apples were good for you, though very often not when eaten raw. Around 1500, it was written that a cook should beware of green salads and raw fruits, for they will make your sovereign sick. And so cooking apples was the preferred way to eat them, either stewed into an applesauce or baked into fritters or pies or roasted on the fire. They could also be dried. They would be sliced up and then strung on a string and left out in the sun to dry, and so they would last a lot longer after apple picking season. Though while most people did not prefer to eat them raw, there was one 12th century medical text that suggested it was good to eat them raw if you were backed up. When raw, they will the lower bowel move. When cooked, both food and useful physic prove. Bad are all apples, but the Appian kind, and ere you eat of them, pare off the rind. And 4 centuries later, the herbalist Jean Girard confirmed this theory when he wrote, "They do not easily and speedily pass through the belly, and therefore they do mollify the belly, especially being taken before meat. Roasted apples are always better than the raw, the harm whereof is both mended by the fire, and may also be corrected by adding unto them seeds or spices." The apples in our pie are both mingled with spices and they're cooked, so we should be good to go. Now, he also suggests taking mashed apples and mixing them with lard and rose water, but not to eat, but rather to spread on your face if you have a bad complexion, namely if you have like scars. He says it will take away the roughness of the skin. So good for eating and for rubbing on your skin and for drinking, because apples were very often used to make both cider and verjuice. And it wasn't just the delicious apples that you could use, but also sour crab apples. Verjuice, meaning green juice, was essentially a vinegar made from apples, though it could also be made from grapes. It was used in a lot of cooking during the medieval period, but it was also used in medicine. When the plague first broke out in Paris in 1348, there was a treatise written on how to protect yourself from it should you be susceptible. The bodies most likely to take the stamp of this pestilence are those which are hot and moist, for they are the most susceptible to putrefaction. Hot and moist don't actually mean that you are hot or moist, but rather those refer to aspects of the humoral theory, the theory that there were 4 liquids inside of you that basically controlled all aspects of health, and if you were hot and moist, that meant you had too much blood or you were sanguine, and so you could either have it let out via a hole in your vein, or much easier was to simply balance it with something that had the opposite properties, like verjuice. Obviously, drinking the verjuice didn't actually cure you of the plague, but they did the best that they could. Now, more popular even than verjuice was cider. Alcohol was often made by fermenting apples or pears or really any fruit, and in rural settings was more often drunk than both wine or ale, as it was easy to make at home. During the month of September, it was traditional to gather up the crab apples on your property so that you could make cider. This activity was included in the 1573 work 500 Points of Good Husbandry, which says that in September you should geld bulls and rams, sow ponds, amend dams, sell Webster thy wool, fruit gather, grapes pull, for fear of drabs, go gather thy crabs. I had to look up 2 words in that. First was Webster, which turns out is not just the name of one of my favorite shows growing up in the 80s, but was an old term for weaver, and that makes sense why you're giving the weaver your wool. The other word was drab. Now, today it can mean, kind of plain and everything, but even back then it could also refer to just plain undyed wool. But that is not how it is being used here. Here, it means an unclean, promiscuous woman, very often a harlot. This is how Shakespeare typically uses the term, like in Macbeth when the witch's brew calls for the finger of birth-strangled babe, ditch delivered by a drab. But why, oh why, would crab apples ward off this type of drab? I'm not entirely sure, but I do have a theory to postulate. Should you end up visiting one of these types of drabs, a harlot, well, then Jean Girard suggests that you might benefit from an apple. For the pulp of roasted apples mixed to a froth in water and drunk by the court has benefited those with gonorrhea. Again, I'm not entirely sure that that's the case, but it would make sense. So, if ever you find yourself in that unfortunate situation, might I suggest you make this tart of apples from 14th century England. So should you wish, just before the pie is done, remove the outer collar from the springform pan if you're using one, and brush some more egg around the sides to give it a uniform color. Then bake it for 5 more minutes, then take it out and let it cool completely before serving. And here we are, a 14th century recipe for tart of apples from the court of King Richard II. It held up so well. The filling, it's densely packed, but it's not spilling out. Looks pretty good. So let's talk about this crust. So this was a coffin, and sometimes they were meant to be eaten, and sometimes they were not. They would not have been eating with this. They didn't really use forks in England at this time. So they would have used either a spoon or their hands. And so often the top would have been lifted off, and then the inside would have been eaten out, more like a pudding kind of thing. So that's how I'm gonna do it, though I am gonna try the inside. Obviously it would have been the whole pie. We would just take the top off. Here we go. That's really good. It's not too sweet. There's very little sugar in this. So you're getting all the sweetness of the apples and the pears and the dried fruits. And then the spices are really strong, but really pleasant. I mean, it has many aspects of a modern apple pie, but is also quite different. And I think whatever spices you use will really inform that. Like I said, you could use pepper in this or something like that, which would be very, very different from a modern apple pie and would absolutely work. I also really love the texture. It is more like a pudding of some sort, a compote. It's not too smooth, but it's smooth enough. There are just pieces of the dates and the raisins left. That was really good. As for the crust, the paste, we break off a bit. So hot water crust is definitely firmer. It's not going to be as, crumbly as regular pie crust. The flavor's really good. The flavor is that of lard, so, delicious. If you use suet, that works as well. You can add sugar if you want. You don't have to. But really, as it is, it works really well. So today, hot water crust pastry is usually reserved for savory pies, like a pork pie or something like that. But it can be used for anything, and it just makes such a good holder, and that's what the coffin would have been at this time. Either way, delicious. You should make this. This is the apple pie to try for this fall, and let me know what you think. And I will see you next time on Tasting History.
It is a well-known fact that the most perfect sandwich ever conceived by a human being is the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But was it always so perfect? Well, I'm going to find out as I make the very first recipe for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich from 1901. So thank you to Wondrium for sponsoring this video as I investigate the origins of the PB&J, this time on Tasting History. So I suspect that this video is going to get rather different reactions in different parts of the world, because while here in the US making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich is practically a national pastime, in parts of the world they are almost unheard of. In many countries, peanut butter itself is hard to come by, and there are those who believe that the peanut butter and jelly sandwich is an abomination, and for those people, I weep. But maybe I can lead them into the light with this first recipe from the Boston Cooking School magazine in 1901. For variety, someday try making little sandwiches or bread fingers of 3 very thin layers of bread and 2 of filling. 1 of peanut paste, whichever brand you prefer, and currant or crabapple jelly for the other. The combination is delicious and, so far as I know, original. So simple, yet so brilliant. And it being so simple, it means that there's not a lot to actually make, but I am going to show you how to make the bread that was most commonly used for sandwiches at the turn of the century, the Pullman loaf. But I won't be making the jelly or the peanut butter from scratch, because both currants and crab apples are pretty hard to come by where I am living, and for the peanut butter, during this time period, you just run peanuts through the coffee grinder or a meat grinder, and I tried to run some peanuts through my hand crank coffee grinder, and I'm pretty sure that I destroyed the coffee grinder forever. Luckily, the Whole Foods near me lets you freshly grind peanut butter only using peanuts as the period recipes call for. Its gritty texture evokes peanut butters of the past, back when they were still called goobers. Now, with the peanut butter and jelly accounted for, let's tackle that Pullman loaf. I am going to use a recipe from Baker's Bread by Paul Richards, written in 1906. And for that, what you'll need is 1 2/3 cup or 400 milliliters of water, 2 teaspoons of dried yeast, 6 tablespoons or 85 grams of lard or butter, 3 tablespoons or 35 grams of sugar, 5 cups or 600 grams of bread flour, and 2 1/4 teaspoons of salt. So first add the yeast and sugar to the water and give it a few minutes to bloom, and then add in the flour, the salt, and the lard or butter and start to work the ingredients together until they become a rough dough. Then set it out onto a lightly floured surface and start kneading it until you have a smooth, soft dough. It's a rather sticky dough, so you may need to add more flour, but don't add any more than you need to. I promise it'll start to firm up as you knead it. After about 15 minutes of hand kneading, or 5 to 7 minutes in a machine, set the dough into a lightly greased bowl and cover with a wet towel. Let it rise until it's nice and fluffy, about an hour and a half, and while it rises, you can pull out your Pullman loaf pan. That is this, and this is really what makes a Pullman a Pullman. Other names for the bread are pain de mie, pain anglais, or just sandwich bread, but Pullman is the most common that was around at the time, and still today, I think. When you see this, it's usually called a Pullman tin. It's said that the bread gets its name from Pullman train cars, where it was served. Pullman train cars were super luxurious train cars at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And I'm sure that's true, but I like to think that it's because the tin kind of looks like a train car. But really, the Pullman loaf is special because when it's baked in here, with the lid on, it has very little crust, and so it's pretty much perfectly square and has very little crust, so it's perfect for tea sandwiches, which were little sandwiches that they would cut the crusts off of anyway. So really, this is like the original Uncrustables, but you don't have to freeze them. So butter the inside of your Pullman loaf pan. Mine is 13 inches long, but they do make them smaller. If you do use a smaller size, you'll just have to reduce the amount of dough that ends up going in the loaf pan. Once buttered, knock the air out of your risen dough and turn it out onto the counter and stretch it into a large rectangle just slightly wider than your pan. Then roll it up into a log and press the seam together, then tuck each end into itself, folding it over onto the seam, and then press the dough together. Then set the dough seam side down into the pan, tucking it nicely into the corners, and then cover with clear plastic wrap and let the dough rise again. This time you want to let it rise until it comes up almost to the very top of the loaf pan. It's going to depend on the temperature and everything, but about an hour should get it there. Then remove the plastic wrap and slide the lid of the pan over the dough, then set it in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 175 Celsius for 20 minutes, and then take it out, remove the lid, and return it to the oven for another 10 to 20 minutes just to let the top brown ever so slightly. You just want this bread done, and you can tell when it's done by inserting a thermometer that registers 190 degrees. As soon as it's done, take it out of the oven and turn it out onto a wire rack to let it cool completely. You cannot cut this bread when it is hot, so just be patient, make sure you're subscribed to Tasting History, and listen to me tell you about the origins of the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So the story of PB&J is really the story of 3 ingredients: peanut butter, jelly, and sliced bread. And of those 3, the peanut butter definitely has the most interesting origins. Peanuts were grown throughout the Incan Empire in South America. And in the early 16th century, when a Spanish soldier and poet, Garcilaso de la Vega, encountered both the Incas and the peanuts, which at the time were called inchic, he was decidedly mixed on the legume, saying, "If eaten raw, it causes headaches. But if roasted, it is tasty and beneficial. With honey, they make a very good marzipan from it." So at least as far back as 1500, peanuts were being ground up and mixed with honey. Not exactly peanut butter, but getting close, and it sounds delicious. So much so that the Spanish and Portuguese made sure to bring peanuts back to Europe and to Northwest Africa. And it was in Africa that they became a feature of many dishes, and so it's no surprise that they followed the Atlantic slave trade back to the West, arriving to North America with enslaved Africans in the 1700s. Now, was it still being ground into a paste? Maybe, we don't know, because like so much of history, it wasn't exactly written down, and so it's kind of lost. We don't have any more written records of peanuts being ground into a paste until the late 19th century. Now, George Washington Carver is often cited as the inventor of peanut butter, but of the 300 prescribed uses he gave for the peanut butter was not one of them. Credit actually goes to a Canadian, Marcellus Edson, who in 1884 patented a machine specifically used to grind up peanuts. But it was an American, John Harvey Kellogg of Kellogg's Corn Flakes, who popularized the food. Now, Kellogg had some rather unorthodox views on food, and I really need to do an entire episode just on him. But one of his ideas was he was a vegetarian and promoted vegetarianism, which isn't weird in and of itself, but his reasoning that meat was a sexual stimulant is a little different. And so he had other foods take the place of meat, including peanuts. But he found that when swallowed in small bits, they are practically indigestible. Experiments made by the German government show that even very small particles of nuts pass through the alimentary canal entirely unchanged. The mastication of the nut should be so thorough that it will be converted into a creamy pulp before it is swallowed. I'm sorry, but for a man who is obsessed with people not having sex, his writing is rather suggestive, don't you think? Anyway, people sort of found it difficult to make sure that they were crushing the nuts with their teeth to the point of digestibility, as he said. So he says the difficulty is overcome by converting the nut into a paste, or so-called nut butter, by crushing or grinding in a suitable mill. A suitable mill that he patented, and soon after, this peanut butter was being spread onto bread. In 1896, the Washington Post raved, "Have you eaten the very latest dish? I say latest in every sense of the word, for it's a dish that goes with the midnight Welsh rarebit and is the newest and best sort of a sandwich. You take fresh bread and perfect butter. Then you have some fresh roasted peanuts. It's the fad to roast them yourself, ground fine in a coffee mill. Next, you mix the ground nuts into a paste with a little sherry or old port, spread them on the bread, and there you have the sandwich everybody is eating. A peanut sandwich you must have if you are to follow the fashion set, they say, by the wife of a cabinet member." So no jelly yet, but it did include sherry or port, and that makes me lament the dearth of alcoholic sandwiches on menus today. Maybe I'll add a little gin next time I make tuna salad. Probably not. But as it was, the peanut butter and wine sandwich never really took off because it was overshadowed by the flavor combination of peanuts and less fermented fruit. That same year, 1896, Fanny Farmer suggested a sandwich made with a fig spread and chopped peanuts inside. Not peanut butter, but it's no surprise that just 5 years later, in the magazine from the school that she ran, they finally came out with the first recipe for peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which is the one that we're making today. But even though there was a recipe for it, it turns out the sandwich just didn't really take off. First, the peanut butter at the time was very gritty. It wasn't smooth or even chunky, just gritty, kind of like almond butter is often served today. And I guess crabapple and currant jelly just didn't entice. Then there is the added effort of having to slice your own bread. Exhausting. But there were solutions to all three of these issues coming very soon. First, the bread. It was Otto Frederick Roeder of Davenport, Iowa, who first realized that slicing your own bread was for chumps. So, after a few failed starts, including a fire which destroyed his prototype in 1912, he finally introduced a fully working bread slicing machine in 1928. A few companies started using it, but many of them thought that it was kind of a gimmick and frankly not that smart because once you slice the bread, it goes stale rather quickly, so why would anyone want that? But it turns out that pre-sliced bread is consumed a lot faster than unsliced bread, as are the things that go on it like jam and jelly, and so they sold a lot more bread and jam and jelly and the thing took off. It was soon touted as the greatest forward step in the baking industry since bread was wrapped. It was considered so fantastic that even today we still use the phrase, "It's the best thing since sliced bread." So who knew that slicing your own bread was what was holding back humanity all those centuries? Now when it comes to the jam or jelly portion of the sandwich, well, that had been made for thousands of years with very little change in how it was done. But during World War I, the Welch Grape Juice Company, famous for what they touted as the national drink, that is juice, which had become popular in a country increasingly obsessed with the temperance movement, note that Prohibition was going to start just a couple years later, they released a new product called Grapelade. This, they said, was neither jam nor jelly, but jam in jelly form. And it's basically grape jelly. And at first it was only available to the troops who were fighting over in Europe. But as they came back, they did so with Grapelade. There was actually a Grapelade ad that said, "Thank the armistice for Welch's Grapelade." Yes, be glad that the death and destruction from the Great War is finally over, but you also get Grapelade. And this was soon followed by Peachlade, Plumlade, and Fruitlade, which was a mix of grape and raspberry. World War I also helped promote peanut butter as well because there was a shortage of meat. And so just as John Harvey Kellogg had touted all of those years, they replaced the protein with peanuts here on the home front. Then in 1921, Californian Joseph Rosefield applied the process of partial hydrogenation to peanut butter. This allowed it to stay blended at room temperature and not separate into the oils and the solids. Still today, the scourge of Laura Scudder's fans everywhere. The process was first used by Derby Peter Pan peanut butter, who could now churn the peanut butter into a smooth consistency rather than the gritty consistency that comes from peanuts out of a meat grinder. Then in 1932, Rosefield founded his own peanut butter company called Skippy and developed my favorite style of peanut butter, crunchy. But it was the smooth peanut butter that was really popular and became the beloved food for school children in recipes like the peanut butter and tomato soup that I made when recreating the Depression-era school lunch. But its pairing with jelly still hadn't taken off in the school system and wouldn't for a few years. First, peanuts had to go to war. Peanut butter became a common item in the mess kits of American soldiers during World War II. Another common item in the mess kits was Welch's Grapelade, and so it was amongst the soldiers that they took that peanut butter and the Grapelade and put them together between two slices of bread. It wasn't the first time, but that's when it really became popular. And so when they got home, they still had that craving, a craving that I know all too well. That's because, just like flat feet or a receding hairline, they passed it down to their kids. By the 1950s, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches became the de facto food for children when mom either didn't want to cook or when the kids had to fend for themselves. And the peanut butter and jelly companies made sure the sandwiches found their way into every school cafeteria in the country. In fact, when I was a kid, if you forgot your lunch or just didn't have a lunch at school for some reason, then they would give you a peanut butter and grape jelly sandwich between two slices of white bread that was slightly smushed and kept at a temperature just above freezing, so it was really, really firm. And I miss that sandwich so much. I have been chasing that sandwich for 30 years and still haven't really found it, but maybe this recipe from 1901 will get me one step closer. So once your bread is cooled, slice it into rather thin slices. You need 3 slices per sandwich. Spread peanut butter on one, then jelly on another, and then stack those on top of each other and top with one more slice. And then cut that into finger sandwiches and you're all set. And here we are, the first PB&J. So I made 2 here. I have the one with the currant jam as well as the crabapple jam. And I'm super curious about the crabapple jam because usually crab apples are like really, really tart. So I'm gonna start with that. So first things first, she says to serve these with tea. No, they need to be served with milk. They're just too, you know, it's a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. You need something to wash it down with. Also, while I love the idea of the triple layer, I think that just 2 pieces of bread is better, unless this was toasted, which is actually usually how I like to do it. I like to do crunchy peanut butter, grape or strawberry jam, and toasted sourdough. The toasting just lets it not be so
so gooey. But the jelly, that crabapple jelly, it's not as tart as I thought. Granted, I bet they add a lot of sugar because the only ingredients are the crabapple and sugar and a little pectin. So it is pretty sweet, but you still get a little bit of that tartness that you might get from like a raspberry or something like that. Let's go with the currant jam. So I do prefer that, actually. It's sweeter, and the flavor of that jam just stands up better to the peanut butter, which, even though it's just ground up peanuts, has a really strong flavor here. I find it has a stronger flavor than if you were to get like Skippy or something like that. It's just peanuts in your face. But yeah, so I prefer this one over this one. Both very good. Both I would actually take out that second piece of bread. But as for the bread, it's so soft, and it's close textured because it's kept with the lid on, and that's the point. It's meant for sandwiches. There are no holes for things to really fall into. Perfect. Yeah, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Still one of, if not my favorite foods. I know it's so simple, but there's just something about it. Brings up memories. I don't know. So next week I'm going to be in New York City doing a book signing of the Tasting History Cookbook. So if you already have one or you need to get one, come on down to Kitchen Arts and Letters on Tuesday, the 30th at 5:00 p.m. And I'd love to meet you. I'll put the details down in the description, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.